So welcome everybody. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us on Webinar Wednesdays and participating in this topic. So welcome everybody. I signed up to present this webinar quite a while ago, and I was actually kind of curious as to where we would be by this point in the situation, and a little bit worried, well, not worried, but a little bit curious if we would still be in a stay-at-home situation, or if by now we would kind of be used to things and not really worrying about it. But what was interesting is I saw a Fast Company article that came out yesterday on 3 science-backed tips for fighting social distancing fatigue or crisis fatigue. And so, it's very clear that this is still an issue for folks. Crisis fatigue is when you are tired of, when you've had enough of a situation where you feel out of control or have a lack of autonomy and that kind of stuff. So, folks are still dealing with this, even though, we might have found some routines that new routines that we've gotten into. So I think this talk today will still be pretty timely. And as we get started, I want to just let everybody know, keep calm, keep an open mind. You can take notes if you want, but my main request for you is just to pay attention as I deliver these concepts, and just think about how they apply to your own situation or to your own life, to your own relationships. The idea is that we internalize learning in a couple of different ways, but one of the ways is when we have like an epiphany or an aha moment, and we say, oh, so that's why that happened that way, and that actually internalizes it. And then, like we mentioned, we'll be sending out documents, handouts for this, and the article I mentioned from Fast Company is actually one of the articles that you can get. But be on the lookout for your behaviors, your relationships. We're going to talk a little bit about sources for implicit bias, sources of misunderstanding or conflict. So those are going to be some of the things to be on the lookout for. So just real quick, I'm going to give you a little bit of my background. This is me and my family. My kids are out in Salt Lake City, University of Utah. My son just graduated from grad school. My daughter's in the MD PhD program there. This is where I was born. This is where I grew up. This is just a fun picture if anybody's never been to Alaska. This is me and my family visiting, about a 90-minute drive from the house where I grew up at 10:30 at night. So just a little interest there. I first started learning about leadership and leadership development as a NJROTC cadet in high school, and I went on to attend the Naval Academy. So got further experience in leadership and leadership development. I did a couple of tours on ship. One of them was on an ammunition ship where I was a brand new officer, 24 years old, in charge of up to about 100 sailors. Some of them were former skinheads, some of them were former gang members, some had master's degrees, some were old as my dad. So you can imagine that as a young officer, I was kind of thrown in the deep end of leadership and working with folks. So that was definitely a learning experience. And after about 5 years at sea, I went back to the Naval Academy to teach leadership and ethics. And I was the assistant chairman of the department there. And this is kind of where I found my passion for what I do now. And that's leadership and organizational development. I like giving people insights that help them perform better as leaders, but even if you're not a supervisor, perform better just for what your objectives are. And so, that's kind of part of my experience. My last tour in the Navy was with an amphibious beach group, again, in charge of a lot of folks. We did multinational expeditionary exercises over in the Mediterranean, so with Israel and Egypt and Greece. So that was how I finished. And in my last couple of months, I helped set up the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the Naval Academy. And then after I got out, I spent a couple of years as a civilian employee, and then my wife and I started our own company doing communications and leadership and organizational development consulting. And I've done a lot of work with defense contractors as well as government agencies. And then in 2016, I joined the government as the director of the Workforce Development, Division of Workforce Development at the Health and Human Services, Division of Health and Human Services. It's also known as the HRSA Learning Institute, HLI. One thing, though, I want to share is that while I was a consultant, I had the opportunity to go to school at the University of Pennsylvania, and I got a master's in organizational dynamics. And that's where I looked into the neuroscience behind leadership and positive behavior change and performance. And my thesis was to create a leadership model I called the Leadership Catalyst, a new paradigm for helping leadership flourish in organizations. If anybody's interested in it, it's if you go to University of Pennsylvania Scholarly Commons and look up my name, you can download it. It's a PDF. But anyway, the research that I'm going to be sharing in this session today all comes from the research I did in my thesis. So the Leadership Catalyst is a mental model for producing more effective leadership behaviors based on neuroscience and cognitive psychology research. Now today, and I think I didn't share earlier. So my name is Kevin Zachery, and I also, I'm with the government, but I'm also, as they mentioned earlier, an adjunct professor with American University. But anyway, for this model, today I want you to consider it as a model to be a catalyst for positivity and productivity. So for a model for producing more effective behaviors. Positive and productive based on neuroscience and cognitive psychology. And I'm going to kind of run through the model, and I'll give you some tips for how to put it into effect. So the first one is the nucleus of this model is the concept of being. So the generation of our behaviors, our behaviors are generated from different places. Sometimes our behaviors are generated because we kind of feel like a teenager throwing a tantrum, and those aren't necessarily good productive behaviors. Sometimes our behaviors are sourced from wanting to be a good Samaritan, or wanting to help people, or wanting to be a good family person. So who you're being can really play a large role in how you can be a catalyst for productivity and positivity. And sometimes in research, they sometimes refer to this as an ultimate mission. Sometimes it's called a noble purpose. And I kind of want to give you an example of the difference who you're being can make. And so I'm going to share a short video with you. And let's start this up.
This is called How Do I Know? And a lot of times when people hear the phrase, how do I know? The next thing they say is what? How do I know what? But the key really isn't to know what. The key is to know why. Because when you know your why, you have options on what your what can be. For instance, my why is to inspire people to walk in purpose. My what is stand-up comedy. My what is writing books. My what can be going out with some friends to eat. In fact, another what that has moved me towards my why is a web series that we have out now called Break Time. So every Wednesday at 3 o'clock, you should subscribe to the channel. We do a series called Break Time on YouTube. So 3 o'clock, we drop a new episode. One episode in particular, I'm about to show you a clip to. We were in Winston-Salem. So Break Time, this is how it works. I travel the country, I do stand-up comedy, probably an hour and a half at an event. And in the middle of my show, I'll just sit down and start talking to the audience. And funny just happens. Or I'll meet somebody who's really interesting. So I met this one guy, and he said that he teaches music at a school. I was like, all right, you teach music, can you sing? And then I'm just gonna show you the clip. Check it. So you're a musical director.
Yes,
cool.
sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Go ahead.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Wow. That bro could sing, you know what I'm saying? All right, all right. Now, once you give me the version, is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick, if you know which version I'm talking about. Just see if that exists. Let me see what you got.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I see.
So here's the thing. The first time I asked him to sing, he knew what he was doing. The second time I asked him to sing, he knew why he was doing it. When you know your why, your what has more impact because you're walking in or towards your purpose.
All right. So I love that video because when you know your why, your what has more impact. And that's really a good illustration of who is it that you're being in any given moment. If you are in a tense situation with your family, who is it that you're being in the moment that actually might bring it out in a positive direction? At work, who is it that you're being when you're interacting with the team that's going to promote positivity and productivity and collaboration? So I love that as an example. Guy does a terrific job. So to talk a little bit about the being, Peter Drucker has a nice little quote where he kind of takes the focus off of proving how smart or right we are and shifting it more to that we should be, our mission should be to make a positive difference. And then I use personally when I talk with organizations, a lot of times I use this one as kind of my purpose. I borrow from Thomas Edison. He says, if we did all the things we are capable of, we would literally astound ourselves. And then I say, my mission is to help people learn how to literally astound themselves. But when I'm in more intimate company, or feeling like sharing a little bit of my vulnerability, this is my noble purpose: to help people learn how to live more powerful, playful, passionate lives. And what this provides me is kind of a bellwether at any given moment to check in. Am I being consistent with that? Is who I'm being consistent with that person that I want to be? And so that's a great way to set up this idea of who is it that you're being, to then be kind of that source for your behaviors going forward. So here's a question for you. What's your noble purpose? Some of you might want to take on to be a catalyst for positivity and productivity, or some of you might already even have some ideas. So go ahead and type something in chat about what might be your noble purpose. I include the 2 there because it promotes you to have one that's kind of in service to others or to be in action. So that's kind of a little bit of a prompt there. So go ahead and feel free to share that in chat. So as you're doing that, I'll continue. So the model with being as its nucleus, I set up 5 different ways of being that promote, encourage, or elicit those more productive and effective behaviors. So the first one is being mindful, and then we'll talk more about these as we go through the session. Being connected, being intentional, being generative, and being heretical. So for being mindful, I want you to participate in something with me. So what I'd like you to do is, make sure your hands are clear of anything. I don't want anybody throwing a pin across the room. But go ahead and do me a favor and cross your arms. And get comfortable. Make sure you're doing it correctly with with the wrist on top. The fingers should be tucked under the arm, like in this example, and the wrist underneath. The fingers should be coming up, curling over your biceps. So now I want you to look down and look at which wrist is on top. Say that out loud. So for me, my right wrist is on top, and then I want you to switch it. I know you can't really see me in the video, but I want you to switch it and put the other wrist on top. And again, make sure that the new way that the fingers are underneath, and put the fingers coming up over your bicep. Now, for most people, that's not a comfortable shift. It takes a little bit of thinking to do. Some might need to try 3 or 4 times before they get it. But the reason I have you do that is to help you be mindful to the fact that we kind of have 2 different brains in our head. This is a slide that I used when I first started building this presentation, or at least the fundamental aspects of it. And it started out to be our 2 brains, which one is driving the bus. And it really does focus on how the brain's wiring affects behaviors, relationships, and personal effectiveness. And the more that we know about that, the more effective we're going to be. So what we have is the 2 different parts. So we have the limbic system. And the limbic system is in charge of emotions. It's where our conditioned behaviors reside. It plays a role in long-term memory storage. And an important part of that is the amygdala. And the amygdala is what gets involved when we're in adversity, stressful situation, and that's our fight, flight, freeze, and flock responses. Now, the other brain that we have is the neocortex, which is all the new brain, and then specifically the prefrontal cortex. And that's in charge of our executive functions, our ability to reason and logic and analyze. It's also and make decisions, and it's also the source of our consciousness and our personality. So I want to bring up this guy's name, Daniel Kahneman. He's a psychologist, but he won a Nobel Prize in economic sciences because he did a lot of research on how people make decisions. And we relate to ourselves as very logical, analytical people because in a lot of cases we are. However, our brain is wired in such a way that it's actually designed to take shortcuts. But we'll get to that in a second. Because the first thing I want to share that I like about his approach to this is he calls the 2 parts of our brain System 1 and System 2. So System 1 is the fast reacting part of our brain, and System 2 is the slow thinking part of our brain. So when I first asked you to cross your arms, that was System 1 driving the bus, so to speak. That was System 1 driving the actions of you to cross your arms. This is the way you've crossed your arms since you were a little kid. A lot of times you don't even think twice about it. Sometimes you'll find yourself having your arms crossed without even consciously doing it. But as soon as I asked you to switch them up so that the other wrist is on top, that engaged System 2. And again, it's a slower thinking. So you had to think about it in order to put your hands correctly in that new position. Now, one key thing about this, I don't always mention this, but if you're trying to do innovation and brainstorming and trying to come up with new ideas, one trick is to cross your arms the new way because it puts your brain in a awkward position that actually has it thinking differently than you normally do. So that's just a free tip for you. So anyway, Daniel Kahneman, as I said, he researched on how we make decisions. And he discovered that we have a lot of implicit biases and shortcuts. This is a neat diagram. I don't expect you to be able to read all the different parts of it, but these are basically the different names that scientists and psychologists have come up with, the different shortcuts we take. So confirmation bias is one. And that's when there's too much information, so we tend to select those items that support our already existing beliefs or ideas. And that's something that scientists, when they're doing research, have to really be on alert for because they don't want to skew the results. They want to really get the results to see what's objective results. So this is just an example, and this is one of the handouts that I've provided. But what I want to do is give you just a quick example, 2 examples actually, of one type of bias. We have a bias towards expedience, and I want you to be ready to type quickly in chat. You got to do this as quick as you can. So if a bat and a ball cost $1.10, and the bat costs $1 more than the ball, quick, type in the chat. How much is the ball? Don't think about it, just type it. Go, go, go. Thank you, Renata. Okay, a few people. All right, and so most people quickly say 10 cents. However, if you stop and think, use system 2 and think about it, the ball has to be 5 cents because the bat has to be $1 more, and together they're $1.10. However, this part of our brain, this wiring of our brain, has us take these shortcuts in a lot of ways because the shortcut is close enough, and then it allows our brain to quickly get to an answer so that we can then concentrate on surviving, right? So that's one example. Here's another example of expedience. Type in the chat what this phrase is. I'm looking over to the side where my chat is. So yeah, so good. So a few people are typing good times you're here again, but are you sure? So this is another example of expedience our brain takes. And you've probably seen those memes where they show the words all jumbled up, but the first and last letter are the same, and people can pretty much read them pretty easily. So that's part of the power of our brain taking a shortcut. However, as we saw in the bat and ball example, sometimes the shortcut doesn't get us the right answer. So those are some things to be mindful of that we do. Here's another aspect of our brain's wiring, if you will, or our conditioning that I borrowed from Gretchen Rubin. She discovered that we kind of have certain ways that we're wired in how we meet expectations, whether they're expectations that we set ourselves, the inner expectations, or whether they're outer expectations set by others, family members, boss, job, society, laws, those kinds of things. And so hopefully you can quickly recognize yours as I briefly describe these. So upholders actually find freedom within the guidelines. If they don't have any guidelines, they feel really uncomfortable because they don't really know where the boundaries are. So they actually like to have the boundaries, and they feel a lot of freedom there. So they wake up in the morning and say, okay, what's on my to-do list? I'm going to check it off one by one. So they find it very easy to set schedules and set expectations and planning and that kind of thing. The other type is the questioner. Now they find it a little bit easier. So if you're one of these, you find it easier to meet inner expectations, but you kind of resist outer expectations. You don't buy an iPhone just because everybody else is, or you don't get the latest sneaker just because everybody else is. It's got to make sense to you for you to adopt it. Now, one of the things that sometimes happens, though, especially in the workplace, is the questioner is trying to internalize what they're asking for, and it kind of comes across as being problematic to the supervisor or bucking authority or whatever. So there's some aspects of this tendency that can impact collaboration, can impact relationships. The next one is the obliger. And Gretchen Rubin says that out of the scores that the people have been doing on her site assessments, that most people, this is the largest group. So obliger, I do what I have to do. I don't want to let others down, but I may let myself down. So they'll a lot of times give up on keeping their inner expectations because of outer pressures. So an obliger might have a plan to, work out, or actually, let's use this one. An obliger might have a plan to have a spa weekend because they've been working pretty hard, and then get a call from their mom saying, hey, I need some help cleaning out my attic. And so they throw their spa weekend out the window to go help, even though they would rather do the spa weekend and do the attic another time. So there's a funny, in her book, there's a funny picture. There's someone wearing a t-shirt who's an obliger, and it says, sorry, I'm late to the party. I didn't want to come. So that's kind of a great example of the obliger. And then the last one, the tendency, is called rebel. And rebels resist outer expectations as well as inner expectations. And their unofficial motto is, you can't make me and neither can I. And on first blush, it looks like that is hard for rebels to get anything done, but that's not true. What happens is rebels can be very proactive and very on point as far as getting things done. What they have to do, though, is figure out how it fits into who they see themselves as a person, or who they aspire to be as a person, or as part of a bigger noble purpose that they belong to that keeps them in action. So these are some dynamics that go on with the people around you. And so hopefully you've can identify which one you are. But if you go to GretchenRubin.com and do her assessment, she'll send you information on the different types and how to take advantage of that. But anyway, that's part of being mindful, recognizing what my shortcuts kind of cause me to do that I might not be aware of. That's what's causing me to do it. Because we have a very powerful system 2 brain, so that we can actually choose to do things different from what our first impulse might be. So here's some ideas for how can you be more mindful. So the first one is follow Plato's advice, not the first Plato, this Plato. And he said, know thyself. And actually he was referring to Socrates, but I have to use Plato so I can have the fun other slide first. But anyway, know how your brain is wired. So I've already given you a step up on that one. I've taught you about system 1 and system 2. You've actually experienced it physiologically when you crossed your arms both ways. So that you're on the path to the first step. The second step of knowing yourself, of being mindful, is knowing your strengths and preferences. So a lot of people are familiar with Myers-Briggs type indicators. The DISC is another way to learn your preferences of what you kind of default to when you are tackling a problem or doing work. And Herman Brain Dominance Instrument is another one. And then I show you this one. This is one I learned about at the University of Pennsylvania, and I only show it just because I have this overview slide, which is very handy. So this overview slide, even though it says the leadership wheel overview, all of the previous models or assessment instruments that I've already shown you actually has these common basic traits or focuses in common. So they all come from the same 4 basic fundamental aspects. So you have tasks and actions oriented, you have possibilities and ideas oriented, processes and methods oriented, and consequences and details oriented. So it doesn't matter what you're looking at, Myers-Briggs, DISC, or whatever. These are the basic fundamental aspects. And you can imagine when you have different folks on a team that there's some cross connect. Now this shows the positive traits. So as you look at it, feel free to look at the positive traits, and if you want to type in the chat which one you think are the top 2 under normal conditions. So this is system 2 traits. Actually, I'm not going to give you enough time to look them all over and type it in, but this is going to be one of the handouts you get. So the second part of knowing or the third part of knowing yourself is knowing your triggers. So we have system 2 for our normal everyday thinking behaviors, but then we have that system 1 that does the shortcuts, that does the conditioned behaviors. And usually that pops up when we're under stress. So if you know your triggers, then you can anticipate when you might be prone to going into less productive and effective behaviors, or get yourself out of that quicker. Anybody that's familiar with Daniel Goleman has read about his concept of emotional hijack. It's also called an amygdala hijack. So when we're under stress, our brain triggers the amygdala to go to work on getting us to survive through that stress. So these are the traits that occur when you're under stress, depending on what your quote-unquote preferences are. Now, it doesn't matter what your normal one is. There's no correlation or connection to what your traits might be when you're under stress. So under normal conditions, you might be more of a task action north-oriented person, but under stress, you might be more of a process method, non-productive traits kind of person. And I point this out so that you can start recognizing when you're in that situation, because again, they're not necessarily the productive and effective behaviors. And this is a good spot for me to mention. I don't like to say good and bad behaviors, because sometimes yelling is a good behavior. If we're walking along the street and you're about to step off the curb in front of the bus, if I yell at you, hey, stop, that's a good behavior. However, if we're working side by side in the office and I yell at you, don't use the Excel spreadsheet, that's not a productive, effective behavior. So try to keep that in mind as we go through. So anyway, that's the overview of kind of the system 1 and system 2 balance. And sometimes one drives the bus and sometimes the other one drives the bus. Now, the Neuro Leadership Institute is a nonprofit that studies research out there, and they also commission their own research, neuroscience, cognitive psychology research, to look at how lessons that we're learning about the brain affect leadership development, learning, organizational behavior. And they took all the things that our brain pays attention to, and they kind of chunked it down to this word SCARF. And what this shows is that our brain is, and this is part of being mindful, our brain is very alert to things that affect our status, our certainty, our autonomy, our relatedness, and our fairness. And you can notice that the red arrow away in the threat, that is a stronger pull on our brains, because again, they were designed for surviving, not thriving. So we do pay attention to the reward side, the good side of this concept, but our brain is really on alert, high alert for things that affect our status. So it could be our status as a project manager, or our status as a supervisor, or something happens that affects our status in the community, or affects our status as a subject matter expert. But anyway, when something occurs to us that might be that we interpret, because it's not always the case, but if we interpret it as a danger to us or a threat to our status, then that will be a trigger for an amygdala hijack. And then on the left side, there's some just examples of what those might look like. So recognizing this concept of SCARF is very handy. And when I do this with teams and workshops and they learn this, it actually gives them a very nice way, gives them some language and a nice way to talk about when conflict arises. Because normally it's not like we sit around the kitchen table as we're growing up and our parents say, hey kids, today we're going to learn about conflict and what triggers our amygdala. We kind of just live and develop kind of through osmosis with this part. And once we've identified it, though, we can at least do something about it. So that knowing this and say, hey, I feel scarred. And I've had this on my team. I made a decision about a program, and my program manager spoke up and said, hey, I'm kind of feeling a little bit scarfed. I thought that around status, I thought that was my program. And I had to explain, luckily she shared that with me and I was able to address it and say, you're right, it is your program, but I got some directions from higher up and I had to step in quickly to make sure that it got followed. And I just hadn't followed up with you yet. But at least we were able to have a good conversation about it rather than having her feel dismissed or upset and not being able to do anything about it, and then affecting more of her work or more of folks around her. So that's the SCARF. Now here's the thing, like in the movie Up, Doug says, my master made me this color so I can talk. Squirrel! Well, the same thing kind of happens with our amygdala hijack. Hey, things are going well, thanks, just being cool, doing my thing, and then SCARF. It can happen like that. So that's just something to be aware of, and that's part of being mindful. Unless you've been practicing this a lot, it's hard to catch yourself right away before it happens, but hopefully you can start catching yourself quicker and then being able to not be affected by that and have actually more productive and effective behaviors. But here's the overview that shows all the traits together, and again, this is one of the handouts that I provided. But in being mindful, it's important to recognize which one is driving the bus at any given time. And if it's system 2 driving the bus, system 1 driving the bus, fast reactive, well, chances are you need to try and get yourself into system 2 pretty quick to be able to use those more productive and effective behaviors. So we have system 1, system 2. When system 2 is driving the bus, we tend to kind of be able to do this, count to 10 before you speak. But when system one's driving the bus, we kind of go with this. And again, not productive or effective. So that's being mindful. The next one was being connected, focusing on establishing deeper, more trusting relationships that promotes better communication and collaboration. And one of the things that Fast Company article stated was that why it's hard in a crisis fatigue, one of the reasons it's hard is because of feelings of disconnection. Humans are a social species. We're wired to connect with other people. If you think about it, back when when our brains were developing, part of your survival was being a part of a tribe. And one of the things that was the most the worst punishment you could get was to be exiled from the tribe because your survivability went down. So our brain's been wired to be really hyper focused on how we fit in with a community, how we fit in with the teams, how we fit in with the people around us. And so in this COVID response situation that we find ourselves, the stay at home, those connections are missing. So that's one of the reasons why the crisis fatigue is coming up, because of that lack of connection with others. And that's why so many people have kind of flocked. Remember the amygdala hijack? One of the things is flocking. That's why so many people have kind of gone out into these different gatherings, because this has been something that they've been missing and has been adding to that fatigue. So Daniel Goleman also talks about this as being a neurological aspect. And he says there's two different dimensions that the MRI discovered, functional MRI, as we started studying the brains. And one is related to that, being mindful. But the second one is the circuitry of our brain that's related to social intelligence, empathy, connection, reading others, how they're feeling, what they're thinking, influencing, persuading, etc. So he even recognizes this scientific aspect. Some of you might be familiar with Brene Brown. She's a researcher around vulnerability and shame. And she says we're hardwired to connect, what gives us purpose and meaning to our lives. So you can kind of start seeing that being aspect with the connect, being mindful to all of that. One of the research studies that I had found that led me to thinking of this as one of the components is a study that they were doing with the macaque monkeys, and they were studying how different neurons in the brain fired. And they happened to have a macaque. This is the story. I haven't been able to, I've heard two different stories, and this one's the more fun one. Supposedly one macaque monkey was still hooked up, being studied which neurons were firing when a researcher in the lab came in on a hot day with an ice cream cone and was eating the ice cream cone in front of the monkey. And the monkey, even though the monkey wasn't moving, the brain neurons that were firing were actually mirroring the same neurons that were firing, that would be needed to fire in order to actually eat an ice cream cone. So whether the ice cream cone is part of it or not, the research itself shows that that happens. And so that's just some one of the items that supports that, how our brains are wired for that connection. So how can you be more connected? Well, first way is to recognize everyone has a brain, which means everybody has a system 1 and a system 2, even if they don't know it. And everybody has, leans towards preferences under normal conditions of what their traits are. So they're, depending on what their preference is, that's kind of how they're going to approach any kind of task or anything that needs to be handled on a team. They're going to approach from that direction. Now, it might not be as useful, because if you're approaching from a task action perspective, but the team's trying to have a process or method discussion, well, that can cause some bumps in the road. So knowing, what the appropriate aspect of the meeting or what we're trying to accomplish is probably pretty handy. And then people also have various ways that they relate to stress. So it's also, the being connected is to recognize that some people are going to get scarfed, and it's going to be around these things. And this is where I usually have the saying, you know, most people, we can always probably think of at least one, but most people don't wake up in the morning jumping out of bed excited saying, I get to cause chaos at work. Most people go to work and they want to make a difference. They want to contribute. They want to work hard. They want to work towards a purpose. They want to be appreciated and acknowledged. So when they don't show up that way, something's getting in the way. And SCARF is the first step to recognizing it. So if you want to be a catalyst for productivity and positivity, recognize that when people don't show up a certain way that you would hope or expect, it's probably because something around these SCARF items is getting in the way. So that's the first part of being connected. It's kind of like being mindful, but outwardly so. Another way of being connected is to assume positive intent. And so Calvin Hobbes here suspects that the toaster is trying to aggravate him with malice aforethought. But like I said in my example, most people aren't trying to cause malice aforethought. So if you can try to have a presence of mind to assume positive intent, then that can help you deal with whatever shows up with the person. You know, it helps you to remove it from being a personal attack, and you're less likely to be triggered yourself when someone else is having some emotions or acting out of their system one brain. Indra Nooyi, former CEO of PepsiCo, learned this from her dad. You'll be amazed at how your whole approach to a person or problem becomes very different. And again, it goes back to who is it that you're being. So if I'm being a tired and overwhelmed supervisor and someone comes to me with a problem and they're kind of being crabby about it, I'm going to have certain behaviors that might come out. However, if I can center myself and say, hey, I'm a person who helps people learn how to live more powerful, playful, passionate lives. How can I behave in this moment to be more playful, passionate, more consistent with that? So your whole approach to a person changes regardless of what the problem is. The other part is to also, be conscientious of people's preferences and how they might be acting out. And again, that gives you some ability to take whatever drama they have and be okay with it, and not to say that you're going to let yourself get walked upon, but be able to handle it with grace, handle the pressure with grace. Another aspect for being connected is to work on the toward reward side. So I want you to look at this under the 5 different items under SCARF. So I'm going to give you a clue. I did not do the initial background of me from a perspective of wanting to brag or show off. So looking at the SCARF, type in which items here do you think I was trying to appeal to on the green side, on the reward side, to connect with people. So if a few people want to type their thoughts into the chat, which of these do you think I was trying to appeal to in order to make that connection with everybody, even though we're virtually online? Thank you, Gary. Yep, relatedness is one. You saw me as a family man, you saw me as a former military officer, you saw me as a consultant, you saw some of my background. So relatedness is one. And also, too, to set up a little bit of a status. I've been studying leadership and organizational development for about 30 plus years. So, hopefully that helps lend some weight when I share these things to, with you as part of my model and saying, here's why you should pay attention to it. So thank you. So thank you for participating in that. So again, the 4 tendencies, also recognizing that people have these tendencies that sometimes grab a hold of them. And so by being connected, you recognize that and can, help them that way. So like, and a questioner, if they might be questioning you about something you've asked them to do, and it's not because they're trying to push back or they have issues with authority necessarily, it's because they're trying to figure out how to internalize it so they can then run with it. So that's another aspect. And I don't know if I mentioned, but the 4 tendencies is part of the handout as well. The next way to be more connected is to be interested, not interesting. This was a mentor of mine a number of years ago shared that with me. It was very insightful. A lot of times when, especially if you're part of your job is involves networking with other people, collaborating with other people, one of the best ways to connect is to be less about yourself and be more interested in them. So that is one aspect that you can be more interesting. And then that's kind of what I meant as far as the, this is why this slide's up again, is because this is where I was originally planning to talk about looking at the toward reward side. Well, here's a note from Maya Angelou that I think really captures this though. You know, she says, I've learned that people will forget what you said, will forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. So I think that's not a bad concept to kind of operate under when you're looking at being connected. So the next item is being intentional. So this is not only taking responsibility for how you affect others, but also as a leader in the leadership catalyst part, but you know, being purposeful about developing a high-performing team and being in action. But from a, and I apologize, I forgot to change this title on my slide, but for being a catalyst for positivity and productivity, being intentional. It means being able to actually think ahead and plan to do things and not letting, you know, your system one drive the bus and actually, you know, figure out your behaviors. So one aspect to help describe this item of being intentional is we kind of go through life as if this is true, that there's a stimulus and then we have an automatic response. And Viktor Frankl, if you're familiar with him, he was a neurologist, psychiatrist, and he was a Holocaust survivor. And when he was interned in the camps, he had kind of an epiphany for himself, and he recognized that regardless of his physical situation, he was free to experience that however he chose. And you know, you could probably say he took on who he was being in that moment was to be of service to others, and he was actually able to help folks that were in the camp with him, help them to, you know, cope with the whole trauma and the you know fatigue of being in that situation. And what he said is that between stimulus and response, there's actually a space. However, we don't really recognize that because it's filled with our conditioned behaviors. So something happens, someone says something, and we automatically have a rejoinder. So one example that I share is when my wife's also a Naval Academy graduate and former naval officer. And when we were both young officers, when I came back to teach, she had already been assigned here to teach. So she was at the academy teaching a full load of English, and she was going to night school 2 nights a week. We had a kid. I was in a new job teaching full-time as well as being assistant chairman. So you can imagine, as a young couple, we had a lot of things going on, and our time was, you know, very packed with things that we had to do. So we made a conscientious effort on splitting up the chores to make sure we each had our own fair share. And my wife and I had we're on one occasion, we're walking down the hall of our house and we're coming around and we're just chatting, not about anything important, and we come around the corner and walk into the kitchen, and in the middle of whatever she was saying, my wife, with a lot of emotion in her voice and probably a few Navy related words, says, "Oh, this floor is disgusting." Now I don't know why, but that stimulus caused me to be triggered, and I had the response of, "Lighten up, Francis, it's not that bad." Now, my wife's name's not Francis. If anybody's familiar with the Stripes movie with Bill Murray, it's the line from there where a guy says, "If anybody calls me Francis, I'll kill you." And he says, "Lighten up, Francis." So you can tell that, you know, I'm kind of have a snarky rejoinder, which, you know, didn't help my case. She looked at me and said, "Well, you never think anything is dirty around here." And so, you know, I'm in my fight or flight freeze response, and I'm pushing back and saying, "I do too. I'm just not uptight about it like you are." So you can see I'm really, you know, doing a good job here of collaboration and, you know, productive behaviors, right? And so pretty quickly she's telling me, you don't do enough, and then what you do isn't good enough, and we're not talking. So that's kind of how that stimulus and response worked out. Now, it just so happened that as part of my training, I went to a seminar while I was teaching to learn more about this stuff. And we actually had this concept of that, you know, there's a space between the stimulus and response. And so, you know, one of the exercises was think about a recent argument, because a lot of times what we hear and perceive isn't really what happened. And so I thought, oh, I have an argument that's going to work really well here. And they had us walk through it. Now that you're not in the heat of the moment, listen to what was said and consider what it might mean in the situation you're in now. And that's when I kind of realized, oh man, I was a real jerk, because my wife wasn't saying that I wasn't doing enough. She was actually saying she was overwhelmed, couldn't do her fair share, and needed some help and wanted me to take up the slack. Now, she didn't say those exact words, but that was what that was the meaning, that had I not gotten hijacked, I would have been able to understand and had more of that positivity, productivity behavior. And so when I came home from the training and she says, hey, how'd it go? I said, well, I learned these things about me. I learned what A, B, C, D. And she was a little upset. She says, I've been telling you that stuff for months. And I laughed. I said, I know I couldn't hear it from you. But a couple of weeks later, we're walking down the hallway. It's deja vu. We're not really talking about anything. Come around the corner and she says, oh my God, this floor is disgusting. Probably again with some Navy language involved. And my neurons are wired for stimulus response, or I should do it for spacing you, stimulus and response. And so my neurons were wired to start to say again, lighten up, Francis. But I caught myself. I was able to capture and notice this, and I stepped in with a different behavior. I said, well, you know what? I don't think it's as dirty as you do, but I'd be happy to mop it. Do you mind if we wait until after lunch? And she looked at me suspiciously. She says, that's not what you were going to say. And I said, I started laughing. I said, you're right. But that's really what I want to say. And as you can imagine, same circumstance, totally different result. We had a much more productive and positive result out of that, because I recognized this concept of going on of our brains. So, and the reason that when we're learning about how to deal with conflict and adversity, we kind of absorb the lessons of people who have authority figures in our lives. And we kind of capture that, and that becomes part of our conditioning. If you have kids and you've ever walked into the room and said something and all of a sudden think, oh my God, I sound just like my father or just like my mother, that's an example of what's been going on in our conditioning. But the good news is that when we know this stuff is going on, we can actually choose a different attitude and different behavior, just like Frankl did. So the question comes up, how can you be more intentional? So that's trying to leverage I just made this up, the Frankl space, but this is trying to leverage that space. So rather than, so if some of you might remember this show back a while ago, Heroes, and this guy, also named Hero, was able to freeze time by grimacing and clenching everything. But imagine if you were able to do that. What does that mean in the realm of stimulus and response? What does that space actually give you if it's not automatically filled with conditioned behaviors? If you're able to kind of stop in the moment and think about it. And if anybody wants to try and type something in chat to participate, see what you think. So what I'm looking for is if we can recognize that there's a space, what does that give us? So time, yep, TJ, that's time to pure response, great. Opportunity, yeah, thank you. You guys are on the right track. So really what it does is give us the ability to choose our behavior. So in that example I shared about me, in that moment, I was able to, instead of going, leading with my go-to lighten up, Francis, I actually was able to choose a different response. And so that's what being intentional is about, is recognizing their space and doing things that allows you a better chance of stepping in with a good choice or a productive or effective choice. So real quick, here's some things that can promote that ability. The first one, now this won't help you immediately in the moment, but studies show that people who tend to meditate regularly, and this is as simple as just 5 minutes of quiet each day, where you try to silence your mind and kind of just, be loose with your thoughts and not try to think anything. Even as simple as that, practicing a meditation actually allows you to resist being triggered as easily, or allows you to even get out of it quicker. One of the things that they've shown is that Tibetan monks who are real masters in meditation have a very low incidence of having amygdala hijacks. Their brains are actually, it's harder for their brains to be hijacked. So meditation is one example. Dan Siegel talks about, and he's a compatriot, a colleague of Daniel Goleman's, and is a big expert in emotional intelligence as well. And his research showed that denying the feelings makes that hijack longer and stronger. So he didn't title this. This is just one of the names for it. But if you can name it, you can tame it. So in the limbic system, in system 1, in the limbic system, there are no dates or times or definitions or words or numbers. It's all feelings and emotions. So if you're able to recognize the physiological effects and state what they are, oh, my stomach's kind of tight, or, I'm kind of breathing a little quicker, or I'm feeling a little flushed. Just the aspect of naming those physiological feelings or naming the emotions. Man, I'm really feeling frustrated. Whether you say them out loud or in your head, that actually engages your prefrontal cortex quicker than just letting it go through. Now, it won't immediately remove the physiological effects on your body. However, it will engage your prefrontal cortex quicker. So name it to tame it is a strategy you can use to be more intentional. And that allows you to more quickly get to the productive and effective behaviors. And the third way that you can practice comes out of neurolinguistic programming. It's basically using the power of visualization in your brain to affect your physiology and kind of in some of the reset and give yourself some more time. And so one aspect is, I sometimes tell folks, if you're, all of a sudden hit with a conflict or something comes up that kind of is triggering that and you're feeling the effects in your body, kind of put your feet flat on the floor and pretend you're a tree and you have roots sinking really deep into the ground, centering you. And you're kind of, this is a little bit of, communing with nature sort of an effect. But if you can visualize that, one way to think about this is in a heavy storm, a tree will just slightly sway, even though it might be high winds, because their roots are so strong and they're so centered. So just using that kind of a visualization method can be very helpful in allowing you to step into that space. Some people think about their happy place. We make a joke about that now, but that's another aspect of that. So that's out. Another way to be intentional is to know how others perceive you. So again, we think that we're the same people all the time. We think that, of course, people know me, but people don't have access to what's inside our heads. And so they're operating on whatever they perceive, and it's filtered through that scarf glasses, if you will. And so they're alert for things that affect their status and their certainty and their relatedness. So, doing a 360 as part of your business process is not a bad idea, because it can give you some insights into ways to be more intentional, to connect with your people, to improve how you collaborate, improve your ability to be more productive and effective in your behaviors. So that's one aspect. And another aspect, especially if you're part of a team or lead a team, is understanding group dynamics. And we've kind of already gone through that a little bit, but there's different ways to kind of take a bead on how the team's doing that can then give you some things to move forward to help them become more high performing. So there's the 5 stages of team development that we're pretty familiar with. Another model you can use to help you out is the 5 dysfunctions of a team, and you can kind of assess your team around this. And if you determine, we engage in conflict, but not around ideas, well, now you know where you can go to work and be intentional in tapping into more of those positive and productive behaviors. This is an example as well. Looking at the folks on your team through how, what's their preferences, and knowing that they're coming from that perspective and being able to communicate with them appropriately. And then the last one here under intentional that I want to provide you is a really interesting concept about having those kind of difficult conversations. And some of you might be familiar with this, and I like this model because, so the concept is this. There's an axis of caring personally and challenging directly. The other end of it is not caring personally and not challenging. So if whatever you're doing, you're in one of these four quadrants. And if you're not being intentional, chances are you're going to be in one of the less productive and less effective quadrants. So you might care about a person, but kind of be silent to avoid hurting the person's feelings. And Kim Scott, the creator of this model and author of the book, she talks about early on they had a person on their team that they were kind of covering. He wasn't really performing, and they just never let him know. And so she finally felt she had to fire him and told him all the things that had happened. And he was upset. He says, "Why didn't anybody tell me?" And by that point, the relationship was already ruined, and she recognized, oh my gosh, I just was not handling this well. And so she came up with this idea of practicing radical candor. And so, I would highly recommend, this is one of your handouts here. I highly recommend checking out this model. But the reason I point it out is because if you're not practicing radical candor, then you're actually doing one of those other things. You're either being obnoxiously aggressive, you have manipulative insincerity, or ruinous empathy. And those are not positive and effective behaviors, and those are not going to get the best out of people. So the next one is being generative, and I know we're moving in on time, so we're going to go through those. So generative kind of goes back to checking into, not only who you're being, your noble purpose, but kind of looking at how engaged are you in what you're doing, how engaged are you at work. Seth Godin here talks about, is your ideal job one where you get paid but no one knows you work there, or is it really to bring your talents to a position where you can change things? That is kind of an engager that kind of has you on the lookout for things that are positive and productive. Margaret Mead talks about the importance of teams. Only thing that's changed the world is committed citizens, committed teams. So how can you be more generative? So one is determine your purpose, and the Simon Sinek start with why is a good way to do that. He talks, and I forget the guy's name that was in the video we saw. He talks about your why, and here's an interesting thing is it's related to how our brain works. The why and how part of this model actually appeals to our limbic brain and gets and taps into the power of that, and the what is part of our neocortex. So just to do a brief example of how you can try and make this work for you. So my golden circle, my why is to help people learn how to live more powerful, playful, passionate lives. How I do that is by providing insights into performance improvement based on neuroscience and cognitive psychology research. The what is providing leadership, professional development to help government staff better fulfill their purpose. Participating in American University key executive leadership programs to help government staff better fulfill their purpose. Then determine your team's why as well. So he says articulating the team's why can be very powerful. So it can help connect the team themselves and help them make a better difference. And this is an example of what I did with my team at HRSA. So for HLI, we came up with a why, creating a culture where HRSA employees seize learning and development opportunities to reach their full potential. HRSA's goal, or why, is providing quality health care to the nation's underserved populations. So I worked very hard to help people feel connected to all of those whys as part of my trying to be more positive and productive. Now, the last one is an interesting concept, being heretical. So this one kind of came up, some of us remember from our history class. Galileo Galilei was a scientist, but he was also ostracized by the church for being a heretic. And you kind of get the sense that being a heretic is bad, but really the definition of a heretic is somebody who is not only loyal to the organization, but they're also loyal to the higher ideals of the organization. So that's why I bring that up. And Edgar Schein is a big organizational development guru, and one of the things that he says is an important job of leaders in organizations is to help manage culture and help to address that, not get caught up in the false paradigms, because everybody has heard this: culture eats strategy for breakfast. So how can you be more heretical? How can you not get caught up in an artificial paradigm by the organization so that it allows you to have more innovative ideas to be able to make a difference? So the first thing is, understanding your culture. This is a picture that my daughter drew for me for my thesis, where the fish suddenly discovers it's in water. It's kind of the same thing with culture. So things you can do is check out different culture assessments. So the Organizational Character Index is one that is based off of MBTI. The OCAI is another one. It can really give you some insights because it's a different filter to look at your organization that gives you some options for different ways of being, different ways of affecting work. The last part of this, though, is changing your perspective. And for this one, I like to share a conversation I had with a young sailor on the ship one day. And he was a junior sailor, and he was mopping the floor, swabbing the deck for anybody that's Navy oriented. And I was walking, and he was obviously upset. So I said, "Hey, what's up?" And he says, "I just can't believe I joined the Navy to be a janitor, and it's just going to get dirty. So what's the use?" So he was very frustrated with, what he was doing. I said, "Well, I want you to be sure that, or I want you to realize that you actually have an important role." And he didn't believe me at first, but I brought up, I said, how next week we have these inspectors coming on board our ship to see how we fare on testing how we do our different things that the ship does. And he says, "Yeah, I know about that." And I says, "The first thing that they look at when they come on board a ship is the cleanliness of the ship, because that gives them an idea of the engagement of the ship's crew. That gives them an idea of the attention to detail. That gives them an idea of how committed people are to doing their job. So you actually do a very important thing." And I said, and I gave him a challenge. I said, "I want you to consider," I said, "you're not the commanding officer of the ship, so you're not accountable for the success of the ship. But let's pretend for a minute that you're responsible for the performance of the ship. What would you do differently going around day to day if you're the one that's responsible?" And I said, "Just take that on for kind of an academic exercise." And he kind of thought about it, and he was, I don't know that I had totally convinced him, but I think he actually thought about it, because a few days later I was walking around outside on the ship, and I see this young sailor who in action, yelling at a shipmate of his who had thrown a wrapper on the deck. He said, "Hey, shipmate," and he stabbed his point. He said, "We don't litter on the ship." Now, that's not a behavior that he would have practiced if he hadn't taken on what it might mean if I was responsible for this ship. And so that's kind of what I mean by change your perspective. That can actually give you some insights into different actions to use in that space, in that Frankel space. So that's actually the end of my presentation. One thing I'd like you to do, and then we can open it up for questions for the remaining time if anybody has any. I'd like you to share one item from today's webinar in chat that made a difference for you. And the reason I do this is two reasons. One, to get hopefully you've had a lot of neurons firing about how you can see how the stuff that I shared with you applies to your situations and might make a difference in you being productive, a catalyst for positivity and productivity. But it's going to be kind of in that limbic system. So by having you share it and type it, I'm actually engaging the prefrontal cortex, which will help you internalize it a little bit better, actually have it stick a little bit better. That's the first reason. The second reason I do this is because sometimes people seeing how someone else has phrased a difference that it made or how they interpret something actually makes an aha moment for them. So you're not only sharing this with me, but you're sharing it with the other participants, and it might actually make a difference for them to say, oh, I hadn't even thought of that. That's a powerful one. So if you don't mind, if anything from here was a concept that was insightful for you or kind of sparked a, oh, wow, that's a really interesting, I'm not asking if it should have automatically changed your life. I'm not talking about that. But if you could share that in the chat, that would be great. And then other than that, I'm open to any questions that folks might have. And while we're doing that, I'll just go to this. Waiting to do something because you're forced to is rarely a positive approach to growth or leadership. Next time, take the lead, not because you have to, but because you can. So take the lead, be a catalyst for positivity and productivity. So are there any questions?
Hi, Kevin. I made the chat so that you can see all of the comments, but I just wanted to share just really nice feedback from Kimberly, where she said, thank you so much. This has been the best webinar Wednesday so far. Thank you, Kevin.
Oh, wow. Thanks.
And then we have some guests who commented privately regarding your prompt about they've learned understanding their values, how to apply them to create a cohesive team. And you can see a little bit about all the words of appreciation and gratitude for you in the chat.
And I definitely appreciate it. And I just noticed Noah's. I'm glad Noah said, can we get the same socializing stimulus through virtual connection? And that's actually really good. In the article, the Fast Company article, they talked about that a little bit. They say that the social connection through video and Zoom and stuff is not as great. I still think it makes a difference, but they talk about to combat the crisis fatigue is trying to do something to socializing, even if it's distance. You know, riding bikes with someone where you're out, obviously not like in the street, but or you know, one of the things that happens in our neighborhood is people sit on their driveways, and people walk kind of, you know, down the sidewalk and stop and chat. So the socializing stimulus is not as strong through virtual connection. I still think it makes a difference though. But if you can figure out some way to socialize outside, but still be safe, still focus on minimizing the risk.
Karen asks, do you have any advice or resources on developing or working on culture?
So that's a tough one, just because you know, culture is such an amorphous thing, and I like to tell folks you can't really work on culture itself because culture is an effect of how people are themselves working together. So it's almost kind of like trying to get people in touch with their purpose or their why, trying to get the organization in touch with that, and really emphasizing those values or those traits, and trying to keep them as part of the conversation. A lot of times what I found though is by folks, when I work with teams, when I do the leadership wheel with their, you know your preferences and how your behaviors change when you're under stress, and I do the 4 tendencies, and there's some other things that I do with that. I find that that goes a long way to helping people kind of clear out the stuff that is the automatic wiring that gets in our way of being more, some of those more positive, you know, more collaborative, more personable, more creative, and all those things. I don't really have a single resource to do that. I would check out the Arbinger group though, the Arbinger Institute. They have a really nice model for tapping into kind of changing how people interact with each other. It kind of follows that being mindful and being connected. I use them in response to those aspects of my model. There's 2 other additional items that I provided in the handouts that I didn't talk about. One is an article about the importance of being mindful for teams. And the second one is kind of the brain map. It was a brain map I made when I was in the process of creating my thesis. And it talks about, it's a series of questions. What are you doing to be, who are you being? What are you doing to be mindful? What are you doing to be connected? excuse me. So those, I'm starting to get hiccups, I think. So those are some things that might give you some ideas for how to be more proactive in those areas. So I'm looking at Noah's questions about 4 quads with radical, a balance. Unfortunately, I don't know that it's necessarily a balance. It's more of a recognition that if you're not being, if you don't have candor with people, then you're probably falling into one of those other squares, quadrants. And so some people might be very direct, but it comes across in a mean way or a belittling way. And in some instances, that can be helpful because it can spark people to improve. But a lot of times that just turns people off because they don't want to be subjected to that. One of the examples that Kim Scott talks about is she was coming out of a presentation with the founders of Google, and she thought it went pretty well. And her boss was saying, okay, so what do you think? You said a lot, and Kim Scott was trying to throw it off and saying, oh yeah, but that's not a big deal. The thing went really well. She says, yeah, but that kind of gets in the way. And finally, the boss had to stop Kim and say, Kim, when you say a lot in your presentation, it makes you sound stupid. And she wasn't trying to be mean. She was being direct, and she was caring about Kim personally. And she says, I think it's something you need to work on. And what I'd like you to do is get you a speech coach to help you recognize those things. And so that's an example of that radical candor. You can do it in a way that doesn't come across as mean, but you can do it in a way that makes a difference. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're avoiding it and not giving people the information that they need that might help them. For example, if you have someone in the office who has something in their teeth, you should be able to tell them, oh, you got something in your teeth. I know it's kind of embarrassing, but a lot of times we don't do that. We don't want to make them feel embarrassed, so we let them walk around to everybody smiling real big with a green, salad stuck in their teeth. Yeah, you can have those direct conversations too about expectations and standards, and without being mean or without being belittling. So, anybody else have a question? There's still a good number of folks on the line.
Okay, I think we can end the session here.
Thank you, everybody that's left. I appreciate you coming in and checking this out.